It's a good compliment because I did not focus on the social. Because the title was the growth effectiveness. On the other hand, many things have been said before, so I will be sometimes short on slides and will, on the other hand, comment on some issues which have been said, which complemented. On the title, my person to add, thanks for the introduction. The last 3 years I worked as team leader for the new ETS for buildings, road transport in additional sectors. So that was after the other things listed. I worked already since more than 10 years on climate policy, so the list is long. On the title, that sounds a bit boring, probably for many of you. Indispensable role of carbon pricing for a green transition. I think there are two elements which were, why it's perhaps not boring, are first, role of means it's not the only thing. And I would stress the policy mix aspect. And it's a bit a risk to only talk about carbon pricing as the only instrument in town. I come back to that. The second thing is, yeah, it's a given for economists. It's now also politically a given for the existing, but still it was the most controversial part of the package Fit for 55, or one of the most controversial one, was the extension of emissions trading to the sectors. So it's not a given. A summary of the EU ETS, I think on this slide, everything has been said. I think the birth date is the 1st of January 25. I think the good thing, I think we have not celebrated that. So it's an omission which we did on purpose. And of course, here we should give credits to economists, because who on earth, the real world, would have come to the idea to do cap and trade? So to imagine CO2 emissions as a tradable good. So I think that's really an example where science, in this case, economists, impacts real policy making, because it's not an idea which has grown out of natural in the policy world. It took its time, yeah, but nevertheless, that's often the case that good ideas take its time. And also in the EU started first with carbon taxes as an attempt to do carbon pricing. It failed due to the, in a say, a constitutional constraint in the EU system that everything related to taxation requires unanimity. And at that time, the UK was enough to bury every proposal on a CO2 tax at EU level. And then the EU, but not the only country, so it would be unfair to only put it on the UK, but the UK is the most visible at that time. And since then the EU shifted to emissions trading. But I go now I move back directly to the question, the controversial question, should we extend carbon pricing? And where the Commission came to the conclusion that it is indispensable part of the policy mix for if you want to achieve the green transition in buildings and road transport. We had our doubts that the many regulatory instruments which are already there would alone do the job if you don't add economic incentives to that transition EU-wide. Of course, it builds on literature that cite here only van den Werk et al. 21 that those climate policy mixes which are most effective and efficient, they typically include carbon pricing. And it was also one of the results of our impact assessment in 2020 of the so-called 2030 Climate Target Plan. It's a mix of complementary policies, which has several strong funds to both, to only doing it regulatory, but also to mainly doing it pricing. Why? Of course, there's simply the numbers look good. If you look, try to decompose the emission reductions between stationary ETS, so that is the largest part of it, 37%, 22 to 25. All the other sectors since 25 minus 10%. So there is obviously an advantage to do carbon pricing. It doesn't claim now causality, to be clear. That would be another sort of more interesting debate of that, but still the figures speak, at least if you don't have it, figures don't look good. Yes, the next thing would be, so indeed, so it was proposed, and we have also the package has agreed it with some changes, of course, as usual. But the starting point was also here, what was mentioned several times, it requires transformational change. And that was openly said, that was not always the case. But it started to be clear that was part of the whole thing, required transformational change across the whole economy. And we need to look at that way. And buildings and road transport and the rest of industry need to also contribute their share. 42 in our modeling told us 42% in 2030 compared to 2005. That was the cost-effective share. Of course, different models will give slightly different results. That's normal, but the range is not so big actually on that. And some go more near one and more in the other direction, pretty much in the middle of what we see in the outside models. And so that's the package. I highlight briefly that we are all on the same line. So what has been adopted this year? So it's all in force since spring this year, as I say. So we have a significantly strengthened ETS, meaning 62% reductions compared to 2005. It is extended to maritime transport, that was mentioned, and even to new gases in maritime. Then we have the new ETS, pretty controversial, but was adopted at the end. So as part of the package, and that means from 27, so the coverage will be 75% of the emissions we currently have, instead of 40.
CO2.
CO2, no, total. Yes, I know, total. Yeah. It's total. It's no. EU always talks every emission figure. Unlike the scientific models, every emission factor, what you see in the figure in the EU is total greenhouse. But many models talk of CO2, but the EU figures are always total greenhouse. There was the strengthening of the complementary or supporting policies, the Innovation Fund, significantly strengthened, and the new Social Climate Fund. I'll come at the end shortly back on it. Also regulatory policies expansion, so it was a package. So also, well, the buildings has proven controversial. They have heard the debate on the combustion engine or the CO2 standards for cars strengthening. They were quite a package. The next thing, it was about growth impacts in the title, so I felt obliged to put a graph where we have, of course, in impact assessment also analyzed those. But they confirm what Alicia already said. It's either small positive or small negative, depending on the models. We had around 3 models for the impact assessment: a classic general equilibrium model, E3ME, which is more a macro structural model, and then we have Quest, the Commission's. It's another ECFIN's own model, which is a more short-term CG, let's say. But by and large, they all show investments go up. The delta here is smaller than in Selma's figures, but the reason is the baseline again. Because of course, what we analyze is the additional policies compared with was in law since 2018. And that is already requires emission trend. And what Selma analyzed is the total investment needed. I had the impression. Delta also? Okay, good. But the 2%, so then we don't see the 2% of GDP. At EU level, 1% I think is what we see. But indeed, 1% is already a lot in total investment levels. The models in this case, but it's the macro models, they rather see it's 7.5%. I want to use this slide to say something on what is not on this slide. It's the carbon prices resulting from the macro model. And because that's a part which I really want to stress, because it was also mentioned on the communication of carbon pricing. If we want to communicate with the public on what we do, we need to make a distinction between a carbon price as proxy for all climate policies, which is often the case in the models, and an ETS carbon price, which results from the emissions trading instrument, which is combined with many other things. Often this is confusion. And if you see high figures flying around, invariably there's one common feature regardless of what model is used. This model has only carbon pricing as policy tool. This is not the EU situation. And we have buildings and road transport to take that example. We have hospital building regulations, we have energy efficiency overall regulations, we have car standards, we have renewable standards. These all also impact emissions. Question is, so what is the delta which is provided to this mix from the new emission trading systems? It's hard to say because we don't know how effective the other policies. We made an estimate of around first 45% of the adding. So adding from what current policies would already have to deliver, which is the 40 to 45% reductions, the add-on in 2030 might be up to 45%, which comes from the new emission trading system, mainly via the expectation factor. So that means that there's a carbon price to stay. But it means still there's more than 50% which comes from other points. And so it's really a plea to the scientific community, be very clear what your number you are communicating. Are you communicating an ETS carbon price, or do you communicate climate policy driver price? So the policy stringency as in the OECD index. And public accessibility, I mean, we're funny, no, not funny, but for science, it's easy to say 200 to 300 euro as a price. For public acceptability, this is, I think if you want to kill public accessibility, you talk that. Now, we don't know, but the Commission impact assessment says that the complementary policies are effective, as we have in the package. It might be that the ETS2 has 50 euro carbon price. It's very different from what we see in outside studies. We don't do projections on carbon price as we are the regulator of the system. We normally will never find a Commission communication on carbon prices simply because it will impact the market. The maximum what we do is doing some impact assessment and say model scenarios under these assumptions provide these or this price, but we will never find any carbon price forecast from the Commission because we regulate, therefore impact the market. But that's a plea, be careful of what you communicate and what you really measure. And even if you communicate it in good sense, then politicians really use it then the way we've seen that, yeah, the 300 euro carbon price in the German debate is pretty prominent at times. At EU level, we don't see that. If we have a mix of complementary policies. But of course, it depends if the policies go to the high end of the cost or the low end of the cost. But to assume that the regulatory policies will only cover the low end and everything as the price, I don't think that's the reality of what regulatory policies have. Innovation or renewable fuel standards, these are pretty expensive policies in CO2 equivalents. Yeah, so that's perhaps a plea at this point. I come to my last slide. On the revenues, also a lot has been said what is on the slide, so I need not talk much about it. That there are also, what I would perhaps highlight is two things and then go on some of the other comments made. There is, of course, a difference, but economic analysis of this gross impact say to go towards the redistributional aspect. So the GDP impact and the distribution not always are the same when you look what the economic models say. But what we have a lesson in the EU is how important it is to have a solution for the distributional impacts. And it has been always in step. So there was not a single level in the EU carbon pricing where there was not in step what to do on this basis. And there is the modernization fund has been mentioned. The predecessor, what we have since 2013, because we started with real auctioning, 10% of the revenues go to the lower income member state. It's a solidarity contribution from the beginning, that they get a share of the revenues first, and then the rest is redistributed. The modernization fund, which is then the more modern way of giving the money, let's say, has been increased from 2 to 4.5%. There you have at least you need to apply for the funds. There's a committee, you cannot do whatever you want. That's just, so governance system. This has been doubled, increased, of course, because of the revenues don't go linearly with the price. So the percentage needs to be increased to have similar effects. Also, three new recipients countries have been added to the list. So it's now 75% of GDP instead of 60% of GDP, which is for the add-on the criteria that covers, I think, Greece, Portugal, and Slovenia in addition. The Social Climate Fund, another example of the real in-step approach. You cannot come with a cost system perceived as costly with not having a clear measure addressing it. Going briefly on some of the things what we heard. First, on the estimates of revenues. The Pisani-Ferry and first estimate is only the existing ETS. So we have tried to do an estimate for the whole decade, 21 to 30, what amount of ETS1 and ETS2 revenues would go to member states. So where the funds like Innovation Fund is already deducted, or Social Climate Fund. And you see it's a range between 400 and 560 billion. This is massive. So what correlates to that, and that's an important change to just complement Stefano's very useful overview already. Therefore, we went away from the 50% should to 100% shall provisions, how the revenues are used. So the old provision was 50% of the revenue should be used for climate and energy purposes. The new provisions are 100% shall be used for climate, energy, and social purposes. It's a relatively long list of uses, but it is clearly an approach. Yes, this amount of money needs to be in step, needs to be visibly used, because that we know from all the studies that the revenue use is important. And it was interestingly the co-legislators who said also in the Social Climate Fund there should be a cap on the direct income compensation. Commission had rather said it should be temporary, so directly compensate. But both Parliament and Council said no, we cannot allow this to be fully used for that. So the cap is now 37.5% of the Social Climate Fund, and only go for direct income. And if you do it, you should also have a plan how you increase investments for those groups who get direct income support. A last element, I think then I need to close for time, is perhaps on the industrial policy aspect, to come back on that. I think what I see sometimes missing in the presentation we had on the industrial policies, we have two aspects of carbon pricing where this matters. One is the incentive effect for private investments. Making it more expensive than the fossil and makes it cheaper or more attractive to attract an alternative. So that should leverage private investments. That's the one side. The second is what do you do with the revenues and how can you there consider industrial policy aspects there. The Innovation Fund is, of course, the most prominent example, is also Antoine. And so I can say, yes, we need to, it's estimated around 40 billion euros volume until 2030 for really getting the innovative technologies to the first step of market with different instruments. So, and I think I was happy that there was finally a German-French economic advisor paper out which made a link between industrial policy and carbon pricing, because the debates are surprisingly separated. But I think both the advisory boards of France and Germany both put recently a common paper out and said and compared the US approach to the EU approach and said what is lacking in the US approach is the demand side signal. Yeah, if you also subsidies are okay for the industry, it's demand, but for the it remains supply side signal. But if you don't send also on the demand side and say okay, the rebound effects, whatever, you will then run into trouble. So I think that was an interesting complement to the debate, but this would be my last plea to close. Thinking the things together,